This video focuses on government attempts, whether it be through amendment, court case, or congressional legislation, that was really meant to protect civil rights during the 1960s and also 1950s. We're going to start in the early 1950s with the case of Brown v. Topeka Board of Education. This is the infamous Supreme Court case that dismantles legalized segregation, the idea of separate but equal within public schools. So it's historically significant, but it's also important to note that it only impacts public education. It's not dismantling legalized segregation really in any other area of American society. This case involves a student, Linda Brown, who was denied the ability to attend her neighborhood elementary school because it was all white, and having to travel a more significant distance to a school that was designated for her that had considerably inferior resources. So they filed a suit alleging that their constitutional rights were being violated, specifically their 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court rules in favor of Linda Brown and her family, and essentially this dismantles legalized segregation. It's super interesting to listen or to read the Supreme Court's rationale in this case, that they don't really focus on the idea of the resources being unequal, because that could be something that could be rectified by states and local communities by preserving segregation, by attempting to even out the resources. Instead, the Supreme Court really focused on the psychological impact of segregation and how it established a sense of inferiority within African American children, and that was their basis for declaring that separate was inherently unequal. So obviously one of the more significant Supreme Court cases in our country's history. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is responsible for ending segregation in all other areas of American society. So it's about that 10-year gap between Brown v. Board and the time in which President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64 that ends legalized segregation in every other remaining area of American society.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the President sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The President seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary. and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present.
All right, so you sort of get a feel for the overall significance of the ceremony from the news clip that played during the time period and Johnson's sort of explanation of what the purpose of the 64 Civil Rights Act was. The 24th Amendment is responsible for specifically addressing in 1964 one of those barriers that we previously talked about involving limitations on African American voting, and that is it officially abolishes the poll tax and eliminates the requirement of having to have people pay in order to vote. So that begins to dismantle some of the barriers to really realizing like the full sort of meaning and potential of the 15th Amendment that at this point had been passed about a century earlier. And then it's really the 65 Voting Rights Act that's passed in August of 1965 that is responsible for knocking down all of the other remaining barriers that we talked about. 24th Amendment just focuses on the poll tax, and then all the other things like voting vouchers and literacy tests, grandfather clauses are all dismantled by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which again is passed by Congress and signed by President Johnson. This was in large measure a response to the voting rights marches that had predominantly taken place in Alabama that were being led by Dr. King. Several months earlier, the infamous voting rights march led by Dr. King, civil rights student advocate at the time, John Lewis, who would later go on to be a long-time congressman from Georgia, basically led a march from Selma, Alabama, to the capital, Montgomery, where initially they were met with violence, and the images that were broadcast all across the world and the country of these peaceful protesters protesting for the right to vote being met with violence by government officials really won over many of the hearts and minds of American citizens, put a tremendous amount of pressure on Congress and President Johnson, and the 65 Voting Rights Act sort of is born as an attempt to dismantle all the other barriers, racial barriers to voting, and this was Johnson's famous explanation of the occasion.
It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
All right, so again, these are a handful of the very significant pieces of legislation or amendments or court cases that were instrumental in providing much needed civil rights to African Americans during this time period.